exam. Okay, first question today. Which of the following behaviors is defined in observable and measurable terms? So remember, the first thing we do when looking at behavior is we'd have to define it. We want to define it using observable and measurable terms. What does that mean? That means we can see it occurring. Okay, so it's an outward public event, and we're going to be able to measure it repeatedly, accurately, and validly. So let's find our answer choice that accurately reflects those terms. Something that's observable, something that's measurable. Remember, we want to avoid mentalisms like thoughts and feelings. We want to avoid trying to measure a diagnosis. Okay, we want things that are outward that we can see. First, Britt believes that her classmates mock her behind her back. Can we measure Britt's believing behavior? No. Okay, we can't see Britt believing anything. We either have to take her word for it, or we just have to make the assumption that Britt is believing this. Okay, we can't observe it. We can't reliably measure it. So A is out. B, Greg's autism results in violent outbursts at seemingly random times. Remember, we never want to define the behavior in terms of the diagnosis that the person might have, right? We can't measure autism, okay? And we're not going to blame these violent outbursts on the autism, okay? We need to figure out another reason why the outbursts are happening, and we have to define those outbursts better. What about C? Jerry claps his hands together when his mom gives him ice cream. Sure. Can you observe Jerry clapping? Yes. Can you measure Jerry clapping? Sure. You can measure frequency, right? You can measure latency, okay? You can measure IRT. There are many things you can measure Jerry's clapping by. And then we know we can observe it and when it happens because we have a clear antecedent. Okay, so far, C is the most observable and measurable behavior. Always read all your answer choices because you're looking for the best one. So D, Joe became frustrated when presented with the math exam. Again, what are we trying to avoid? These feelings, these thoughts, these emotions, frustrated, okay? We can't observe it. We can't measure it. We might think we might be able to observe frustration, but sometimes frustration is internal. Sometimes it doesn't outwardly show. So the clearest, most observable, measurable behavior is Jerry clapping his hands together. 2, backward chaining is just one method used to teach the steps of a complex task. Which of the following is a primary reason you would use a backward chaining procedure? Okay, so remember, for task analysis and task chaining, we have a forward chain, we have a backward chain, we have a total task chain. What is the difference? The difference typically lies in when you provide reinforcement. In forward chaining, you provide reinforcement after the first step. In backward chaining, you provide reinforcement after the last step. In total task, you provide reinforcement after the whole chain is done. Okay, so why would you use backward chaining procedures over the others? Okay, A, it is easier to implement than a forward chain. Not necessarily. It really is dependent on the skill you're teaching. Okay, whether it's going to be harder or easier. You also have to consider the client's needs, how cooperative they are. Okay, so we can't just make a blanket statement saying that backward chaining is easier than forward chaining. So A is out. B, if the learner is reinforced by escape from a task. Yeah, this would be a good reason to use backward chaining. Think about backward chaining and when the reinforcement is delivered. You prompt the client through the entire task, and then once they complete the final step in backward chaining, they're reinforced, typically through escape. If you're tying shoes, right, or making a sandwich, okay, the chain is over once they complete that final step, so they can escape from whatever task you're doing. If you're doing forward chaining, they're reinforced after that first step, but they still need to be prompted through the rest of the chain. So if the learner is reinforced by escape from a task, that would be a great reason to use backward chaining. So B is very good. Always read all your answer choices. C, you want to use a punishment procedure? No, we're going to use reinforcement with chaining. Okay, so C is not related to why we would use a certain type of chaining. and then D, there is no difference between backward and forward chains. That's obviously incorrect. Okay, how you teach and how you reinforce are two different things depending on what kind of chaining you use. So our answer here is B. Differential reinforcement leads to discrimination and differentiation. Which of the following examples best represents discrimination? Okay, first, what is discrimination? Discrimination is being able to tell the difference between two stimuli, right? You can just pick from 2, 3, 4, how many stimuli, and you're able to identify the difference. What about differentiation? Differentiation is similar, but instead you're able to engage in multiple responses. So discrimination has to do with the stimuli you're choosing. Differentiation has to do with the response you're choosing. So we need the example that represents discrimination. We're going to look for a answer choice that has us identifying the difference between two or more stimuli and picking one stimuli over another. Okay, so let's look at A. An artist uses several different shades of red in their watercolor painting. Would the artist need to be able to discriminate? Absolutely. Okay. If we're using several different shades of red, they probably look pretty similar. Okay, so we would need to be able to tell the difference and discriminate in order to make that watercolor painting correctly. So A looks like our answer, but don't get ahead of yourself. Read all your answer choices, look for the best answer. Okay, so B, the child refers to all motorized vehicles as cars. Well, that's clearly the opposite of discrimination. He is not discriminating. Whenever he sees a motorized vehicle, he says car. So that could be a truck, a van, a motorcycle, whatever, everything's a car. That's the opposite of discriminating between vehicles. What about C? Gordon is able to chop, slice, and dice with a knife. Well, what do we say about different responses? If we're choosing different responses, what are we doing? We are differentiating. Okay, so this is not discrimination. This is multiple responses. This is differentiation. And then D, whenever Tim sees a woman with blonde hair, he calls her mom. Again, the opposite of discrimination. We are referring to multiple stimuli using the same word. We are not telling the difference. The only one where we are actually discriminating is an artist using several different shades of red. We have to know which red to use, and we can identify and pick out the difference between each one of those stimuli. Okay, your BCBA is training your client's parents on implementing contingencies. Which of the following examples would incorrectly describe a contingency? So remember, what is a contingency? Start there. Well, it's an if-then statement. If you do something, then you get this reward. First, you do something, then you get this. Before we can do this, we have to do this, right? You're setting up a contingency so you can deliver reinforcement and try to strengthen these behaviors. Okay, you're trying to set up motivation, you're trying to set up reinforcing opportunities. Okay, the key is the response that you want to see must happen before the reinforcer is delivered. If the reinforcer is delivered before the response, that's considered bribing. Okay, so the if then has to go in that order. If you do this, then you get this. If you do the reinforcer first before the response, that is bribery. So we want to figure out which of the following examples would incorrectly describe a contingency. Basically, we're looking for an instance of a bribe. Okay. So A, if you clean your room, I will give you $1. Is that a contingency? Absolutely. If clean, then $1. B, first do your homework, then we will go outside and play. Is it a contingency? Definitely. First, then, right? First you do your homework, then you get reinforcement. What about C? Before you can eat dessert, you must eat your vegetables. Sure. Before dessert, first vegetables. You're making them engage in the response you want to see before delivering reinforcement. That's crucial in a contingency. So that leaves us with D. Here is the new toy you wanted. Now you must behave in school. This is a bribe. You've given them the reinforcer already. Now they have no real incentive to go and behave. Okay. To make this a contingency, you would have to say, if you behave in school today, then you get the new toy. Okay. but D is actually representative of a bribe, not a contingency. So you would not want to use this example to train the client's parents on implementing contingencies. Which of the following is false about the y-axis on a line graph? Okay, what do we know about a y-axis? Think about everything you know. We know it's vertical. We know it represents behavior, okay? So we know those are true. What is false? Well, our answer choices, it represents behavior, C, we know that's true. It is vertical, we know that's true. So we have A or B. Is it called the ordinate or is it called the abscissa? Well, we know the y-axis is called the ordinate, so the only false statement here is the y-axis is considered the abscissa. The x-axis is the abscissa. The y-axis is the ordinate. The way I remember that is y-o, yo. So yo, y-axis ordinate, and then x-axis is the abscissa. The only false statement here about the y-axis is B. Okay, you and RBT was collecting data on a 7-year-old boy with autism. You're tracking how often he scratches himself. If the client's fingernail drags across the skin and leaves a mark, you consider it a scratch. You record behavior in 15-second intervals. If the client is engaged in scratching at the end of the interval, you record a response. You're using what? Okay, so all this information about the behavior is irrelevant. Remember, understand what the question is asking. The question is asking about the type of measurement. Look at our answer choices. We have all these time sampling and interval recording options. So which one are you using? Well, we know we have an interval, right? And if the client is engaged in scratching at the end of the interval, you record a response. So which one of these time sampling or interval recording methods has to do with the client engaging in a behavior at the end of the interval? Is it partial interval? Well, no, in partial, if the behavior happens at all during the interval, it counts as a response, okay? We're looking for the one at the end. What about play check? Yes, but what is the key with play check? Play check is a group system, okay? It's a group time sampling option. We have a single person, okay? So we have momentary time sampling. What is momentary time sampling? Momentary time sampling is if the response occurs at the end of the interval, you record it. What are we doing here? If the client is engaged in scratching at the end of the interval, you record it. Boom. C is great. It's our answer. Let's look at D and figure out why that's not our answer, okay? Whole interval recording. Well, of course, the behavior has to occur the entire interval for it to count. When you're studying, make sure you understand why an answer choice is correct and why an answer choice is incorrect. You'll get really good at the test if you're able to do both, okay? And that's where speed comes from. Don't try to go too quickly in the beginning, but once you get better, your speed will start to increase drastically. Okay, the first step in behavior reduction, before you can collect data on a behavior, observe the behavior, or implement a behavior reduction strategy is what? What do we need to do first for behavior reduction? Okay, don't overthink this. Before we can collect data, before we can observe the behavior, what do we need to do? Okay, do we need to take accurate data? Yes, we want to take accurate data, but is that the first step? No. Before we can take data on a behavior, what do we need to do? What about B? Define the target behavior. Yeah, absolutely, right? Before you can take any sort of data, we need an actual behavior to observe and measure. Going back to our first question today, this is why it's so important to describe behavior in observable and measurable terms. That way, we can start to take baseline data, right? We can choose a measurement system. We can take accurate data, but before we can do any of that, we have to actually define our target behavior. Our answer is B. Which of the following would be the least acceptable method of identifying a client's stimuli preferences? So what are we doing when we're identifying stimuli preferences? This is simply a preference assessment. How are we going to figure out, excuse me, what the client prefers, okay? we need the least acceptable method of doing that. Is it A, present items in an array and record what items the client interacts with? Yeah, that's acceptable. That's some sort of multiple stimulus with or without replacement. So absolutely. What about B? Look up a list of items online that many kids enjoy. Would that be effective at identifying your client's preferences, their individual preferences? Maybe, but it's really not the best way to go about it, right? Because that list might not be relevant to your client at all. Sometimes children have strange interests, right? And that list, even though many kids enjoy those items, they might have nothing to do with your kid, okay? So B so far is the least acceptable. This is why you have to read all your answer choices, because we still have C and D. If C and D are worse than B, then we're going to choose that, okay? So far, B is our worst answer. C, ask the client's parents what the client likes. Sure, we can assume that the client's parents know them pretty well. They should know what they enjoy. Asking the client's parents would be perfectly acceptable. And then D, ask the client what they like. Absolutely. Go straight to the source, right? Involve your client, get them involved. Asking them what they like is a totally fine way of figuring out stimuli preferences. So the least acceptable is looking up a list of items online that many kids enjoy and using that to gauge their preferences. You start to suspect that your client is being abused. You should immediately report this to who? So RBTs are mandated reporters, meaning if you think abuse is occurring, you have to report it immediately, okay? So the question becomes, who do you report that to? A, the company owner? No, remember, who is responsible for your case? Well, the supervisor, okay? So although whoever owns the company, right, might know about the case, the person ultimately responsible for what happens on that case is your supervisor, right? So A really wouldn't be the person we'd go to first. What about the BACB, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board? Well, they don't handle individual cases, okay? So this matter is not necessarily relevant to them unless somehow your supervisor, BCBA, is actually involved in the abuse, okay? But if they're not, the BACB is irrelevant. What about the client's parents? Well, maybe the client's parents are the one engaging in the abuse or fostering abuse, okay? So in all situations, you would not immediately go to them, okay? If you think abuse is coming from somewhere else, maybe. Before you do that, before you take it upon yourself to report this to the parent, you should go to who? You should go to your supervisor. Remember, no matter what, always go to your supervisor first, okay? Remember our task list. Communicate effectively with your supervisor. Since you are a mandated reporter, go to the supervisor, report it to them, and then report it to any government agency that may be relevant. Finally, a high quality reinforcer could possess one or more of the following qualities. Which quality would be unacceptable? Okay, so high quality reinforcers mean they're very effective at changing behavior and for a variety of reasons. What are characteristics of a high quality reinforcer? The reinforcer is delivered immediately. Absolutely, right? Immediacy of reinforcement is very important. The closer we can deliver reinforcer to the behavior, the better, okay? So definitely that would be acceptable. The reinforcer is harmful to the client. Would that be acceptable? Let's just say we have a harmful reinforcer that's very effective at changing behavior, but it is damaging our client in some way. Well, part of our ethics is to do no harm. Therefore, delivering a reinforcer, regardless of its behavior change properties, that is harmful would be unacceptable. So B looks like our answer. Let's read C and D. C, the reinforcer has acceptable magnitude. We always want a reinforcer that is strong and big enough with significant magnitude, okay? That quality would be acceptable. And then the client enjoys the reinforcer. Sure, that never hurts, right? If the client actually enjoys or likes the reinforcer, okay? So the quality in a reinforcer that would be unacceptable is harmful to the client. Okay, that does it today. We'll be back Wednesday with more practice questions. And then Sunday, we'll have our Sunday shout out. I didn't do one yesterday. So we'll have a 2-week one. Remember, when you do pass, let us know so I can include you in that. Other than that, keep working hard, keep studying hard, and I'll see you soon.